I've always found solace in the solitude of camping alone. There's a unique kind of peace that comes from being surrounded by nature, far from the noise and chaos of city life. My latest adventure took me to a remote forest I'd never visited before. It was a place I'd read about in a few hiking blogs, isolated, serene, and perfect for a solo retreat. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, and enough supplies to last me 3 days. Among my essentials were a flashlight, a portable stove, and a good book to keep me company during the quiet nights. The drive to the forest took about 4 hours, mostly through winding roads that became progressively bumpier as I got closer to my destination. Eventually, I arrived at a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. The first night went off without a hitch. I made a modest fire, cooked some beans, and listened to the soothing sounds of the forest as the wind rustled through the leaves. The night sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly, casting a tranquil glow over my campsite. I went to bed early, eager for a day of exploring the following morning. The next day was spent hiking through the dense forest. I spotted a few deer and a fox, but no other humans, which was precisely what I had hoped for. After hours of exploring, I returned to my camp in the evening, cooked some noodles, and settled by the fire with my book. As the night grew darker, I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. An unsettling stillness hung in the air. The forest, usually alive with nocturnal sounds, was eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me. I checked my watch. It was 3 a.m. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, and eventually managed to fall back asleep. Morning came with the comforting sounds of birds singing and the sun filtering through the trees. I felt foolish for letting the silence of the night scare me. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside only to stop in my tracks. On the small camping table I had set up outside my tent was a cup of tea. The steam rising from it suggested that it was still warm, and it looked like someone had taken a few sips from it. The problem was, I hadn't made any tea that morning, and I certainly hadn't boiled water since the night before. My heart raced as I looked around the campsite. Everything else was in its place. My food, my gear, nothing was missing. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who had made the tea, and why hadn't they woken me up? I tried to rationalize the situation, telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I'd made the tea and forgotten about it. Maybe I'd sleepwalked. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. I decided to pack up and leave. The forest no longer felt like a peaceful retreat. It felt menacing, like it was watching me. I quickly gathered my things, packed up my tent, and started the hike back to my car. Every sound made me jump. A snapping branch, a bird taking flight, even the sound of my own footsteps. When I finally reached my car, I threw my stuff into the back seat, got in, and started the engine with shaky hands. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt like the forest was closing in behind me, swallowing up my campsite and the mysterious cup of tea. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows and tried to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't come up with a plausible explanation. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the forest with me, someone who didn't want me to know they were there. I started to doubt myself. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was it just a dream? But the memory of that warm cup of tea was too vivid to ignore. A week later, I decided to go back to the forest. I needed to know what had happened. I drove back to the same spot, my heart pounding the whole way. When I arrived, the campsite looked the same. I found the spot where my tent had been, the place where the table had stood, but there was no cup, no sign that anyone had been there. I spent the night in my car, too scared to set up camp again. I kept the doors locked and a flashlight in my hand, but nothing happened. No strange noises, no mysterious visitors. In the morning, feeling a bit braver, I got out of the car and walked around looking for any clues. But there was nothing. I left the forest that day still without answers, but one thing was clear. I would never camp alone in that forest again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left unexplored. My friends from college and I have always tried to maintain our close bond even after graduation. Every summer, we set aside a week for a camping road trip, exploring different parts of the country. Last year, we decided on the mountains of Colorado for our annual adventure. We planned our trip for late summer, eager to enjoy the tranquility and beauty of the Rockies. Upon landing in Denver, we picked up our rental car and set off towards the mountains. The drive was picturesque and we were all in high spirits. On the second night, we found a secluded camping area with individual lots that were spaced out enough to feel like private campgrounds. Our chosen spot was near a small creek, perfect for washing off after a long day of hiking. The highway wasn't too far, offering a sense of safety, yet the trees provided a comforting seclusion. We arrived in the late afternoon and set up our camp while there was still daylight. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape. After setting up, we decided to drive into the nearest town for dinner. We enjoyed a hearty meal at a local restaurant, laughing and sharing stories. By the time we returned to our campsite, it was dark. As we pulled into our lot, we were immediately unsettled. The flap of our tent was open, and our belongings were scattered around. It was clear someone had gone through our stuff. Although it was disturbing, we tried to brush it off, thinking it might have been an animal. Still, the sense of unease lingered. To shake off the unsettling feeling, we grabbed our towels and shampoo and headed to the creek to wash up. The water was icy, but it felt invigorating after the day's activities. As we dried off on the riverbank, I noticed movement across the stream. There, partially hidden by the trees, was a figure watching us. My heart raced, but I didn't want to alarm my friends or let the figure know I'd seen them. I suggested we head back to camp. On the walk back, I quietly explained to my friends what I had seen. Coupled with the earlier incident of our tent being rummaged through, we all agreed it was safer to sleep in the car. We piled into the vehicle, locking the doors and trying to get comfortable. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside made us jump, and the memory of that figure lurking in the woods kept us on edge. Sometime in the middle of the night, I glanced out the window and froze. There, crouching by the entrance of our tent, was the same figure. I watched in horror as they slowly unzipped the tent, peering inside. Realizing it was empty, the figure then turned their head towards our car. My heart pounded in my chest as they began to move towards us, crouch-walking with an eerie calmness. I frantically woke my friends, and as they groggily came to, I reached over to the driver's seat and laid on the horn. The blaring sound cut through the still night, and we watched as the figure stopped, stood up straight, and then walked away into the woods, without a hint of fear or urgency. It was as if they were merely taking a stroll, completely unfazed by the fact that they had been spotted. None of us slept after that. We sat in the car, wide-eyed and alert, listening for any signs of the figure returning. The hours dragged by, each minute filled with tension and paranoia. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the trees, we began to feel a slight sense of relief. We had initially planned to stay at this campsite for 2 nights, but after the events of the previous night, we decided to move on. We packed up as soon as it was light enough to see, eager to put distance between us and the unsettling experience. We drove to a different campsite further up the mountain range, hoping for a more peaceful stay. The rest of our trip was thankfully uneventful. We enjoyed beautiful hikes, stunning vistas, and each other's company without further incident. Yet the memory of that night remained vivid in my mind. The calm, almost casual way the figure had walked away after being spotted haunted me. It wasn't the fear of being discovered that scared me. It was the complete lack of it. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched that night, the sense of intrusion in what was supposed to be our private escape. It's a reminder that even in the most serene and isolated places, we are never truly alone. My girlfriend Lisa and I decided to celebrate our anniversary by going camping, 5 hours away from home. We thought it would be a perfect getaway, a chance to be close to nature and away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. We set off the day after a major storm had passed through our area, and the weather seemed perfect for our little adventure. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. The ranger at the entrance informed us that we were the only ones booked for the weekend. Sweet, I thought, imagining the peace and quiet. We drove down the long, winding paths to our designated spot, which was nestled deep in the forest. The road narrowed significantly as we approached our site, making it clear that reversing out would be our only exit route. We unloaded the car, set up our tent, and decided to explore the woods before it got dark. The forest was eerily silent, with only the occasional rustling of leaves to break the quiet. After walking a few miles, we stumbled upon a cluster of old white cabins. They were all identical, lined up in a way that seemed almost too perfect. There was no sign of life, no sound, and no movement. It felt like we had walked into a ghost town. An uneasy feeling settled over us, so we turned back and headed to our campsite. Back at the site, we tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Neither of us had any camping experience, and our attempts to ignite a fire with the soaked wood around us were futile. We managed to get a small flame going with some self-lighting logs and lighter fluid we had bought from Walmart. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, and for a moment everything seemed perfect. The stars above us were breathtaking, and the silence of the forest was soothing. As night fell, the darkness seemed to envelop us. Lisa, who was easily spooked, suggested we get into the tent. We doused the fire and crawled inside, talking in hushed tones. It wasn't long before she placed her hand over my mouth and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I strained to listen and heard it too. Heavy footsteps approaching our tent. My heart started to race. "It's probably just animals," I whispered, trying to reassure her and myself. But then we heard low, indistinct mumbling. It sounded like people talking, but we couldn't make out any words. The footsteps and the mumbling grew louder, seeming to circle our tent. We sat there, paralyzed with fear, as the sounds stopped right outside. We waited in silence, the minutes dragging on like hours. Finally, Lisa whispered, "We need to get to the car." The adrenaline kicked in and I slowly unzipped the tent. Peeking out into the pitch-black night, I saw nothing. I motioned for Lisa to stay close and we sprinted to the car, locking the doors behind us. Inside the car, I scanned the area for any signs of movement. There was nothing but the oppressive darkness of the forest. "I'm going to grab our stuff," I told Lisa, my voice shaking. I jumped out, grabbed our ice chest and threw it into the back seat. As I turned to get the tent, the footsteps started again, closer this time. Panic surged through me, and I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapping the tarp around it. With the tent slung over my shoulder, I sprinted back to the car, shoving it into the trunk. "Do we have everything?" I asked Lisa, and she nodded. I floored the gas pedal, backing out of our campsite in a hurry. As we reached a fork in the road, we realized we didn't remember which path led out. In a panic, we took a random path, ending up at another campsite. Cursing under my breath, I reversed again, and from that angle, I spotted a small sign partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It pointed to the main path back to the entrance. As we sped away, I noticed a faint green light in the woods near our campsite. It was the only light in the vast darkness, and it filled me with a sense of dread. We didn't stop driving until we reached our hometown. Exhausted and shaken, we collapsed on Lisa's parents' couch around 4 a.m. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Who were those people in the woods? Why were they mumbling outside our tent? And what was that green light? The forest that once seemed like a peaceful retreat now feels like a place of nightmares. And I know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping there again.